Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming today. Before we start, if I could ask everybody to silence cell phones, beepers, walkie-talkies, anything that makes unexpected sounds. I'd appreciate that. My name's Paul Erickson. I'm the director of the William Clements Library at the University of Michigan. And thank you for coming to join us for the John Shai Memorial Lecture, which is co-sponsored by the Clements Library and the War Studies Group. I'd particularly like to thank Jonathan Marwell and Robert Danye for their help in helping make today's event happen. The occasion for this lecture is a memorial to Professor John Shai, an emeritus professor of history here at Michigan who passed away in April 2022. Professor Shai received his PhD from Princeton and taught there for 10 years before coming to Ann Arbor in 1967, where he taught until his retirement. John Shai was the leading American authority on the military aspects of the Revolutionary era and was a pioneer in leading the field of military history away from a narrow focus on strategy and tactics and toward full integration with a full understanding of all aspects of our past. His numerous books include Toward Lexington, The Role of the British Army in the Coming of the Revolution, published in 1956, and the widely acclaimed 1976 book, A People Numerous and Armed, Reflections on the Military Struggle for American Independence. The honors he received over the course of his career are too numerous to mention here, but perhaps his most important legacy is as a beloved and rigorous instructor of both undergraduate and graduate students at the University of Michigan. His creation of the War Studies Group here in Ann Arbor, and his long-standing service to the William Clements Library, including several decades of service on the library's Committee of Management. John Shai's distinguished career of scholarship and service explains why our speaker tonight was the first person who came to mind when we thought about who to invite to give a lecture in Professor Shai's memory. Fred Anderson is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he taught early North American history from 1983 until his retirement in 2018. Professor Anderson is the author of numerous books, including A People's Army, Massachusetts Soldiers and Society in the 7 Years' War, Crucible of War, The 7 Years' War and the Fate of Empire in British North America, 1754 to 1766, which was awarded the Mark Linton History Prize by the Columbia Journalism School and the Francis Parkman Prize by the Society of American Historians in 2001. And with Drew Caton, Dominion of War, Empire and Liberty in North America, 1500 to 2000, and Imperial America, 1672 to 1764, a volume in the Oxford History of the United States. A legendarily generous instructor and mentor, Professor Anderson was named a College Professor of Distinction at CU in 2010, a title that is reserved for scholars and artists of national and international distinction who are also recognized by their college peers as teachers and colleagues of exceptional talent. Please join me in welcoming Fred Anderson back to Ann Arbor.
Am I broadcasting? Can you? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Paul, for that generous, excessively generous introduction. And thank you all for coming. Also, thank you to the Michigan War Studies Group, to Jonathan Marwell, and to Bob Danye, whom I met for the first time at a delightful dinner last night, and especially to Arlene Shai, who's really the reason I came. I was always fortunate in my my life, but never more fortunate in that I got a reply to a letter I wrote at random when I was in my third year of graduate study to John Shai, inviting me to Ann Arbor I wrote to him, actually, I'm sorry, I wrote to him to ask his help with my dissertation prospectus, which wasn't going particularly well. And he invited me to come to Ann Arbor and then introduced me to his wife, Arlene, who in turn introduced me to the riches of the Clements Library. I have been an enormous fan of Ann Arbor, and particularly of Arlene Shai, ever since. And I'm deeply grateful to be here this afternoon, this evening, to talk about John's remarkable influence, not just on me, but on the way we conceive American history and why that matters. The term new military history is now so old that it takes either a considerable effort of memory for historians old enough to remember when it was actually new, or at least a small feat of imagination for historians under the age of about 70 to think of a time before the term existed. Having diligently searched for its first scholarly use in print, I can now confidently assert that the term originated in print in January 1976. And since this marks the starting point of my talk, a preliminary reflection may be in order on the vanished world into which this new military history was born. Historians in the mid-1970s were uncommonly eager to identify themselves with novel approaches, which meant that graduate students preparing for their comprehensive examinations, preoccupied with pigeonholing historians and their works, might be excused for seeing the new military history as one more category to add to a list of new histories, including the new social history, the new political history, the new cultural history, and the new economic history, the practitioners of which annoyingly spoke of themselves as cleometricians. So I was one of those graduate students, and probably not alone in failing to understand that the new military history, in fact, differed dramatically from the other new histories in its conceptualization and its purpose. I certainly did not anticipate that over the next half century, those differences would enable the new military history to undermine, challenge, and potentially alter several of the grand narratives that structure our understanding of the global past. In fact, I had no idea that several of those grand narratives existed, or indeed any of them, because the term wasn't even invented until 1979, when Jean-François Lyotard coined it in French, which delayed me in understanding the term for about 25 years. Its influence, anyway, on these grand narratives, the new military history's influence on these grand narratives, is particularly clear in looking at the way North America developed between 1500 and the present. Now, those other new military histories modeled their approaches, those other new histories modeled their approaches more or less on the Annales school, which investigated the underlying structures of past economies, societies, and civilizations by social scientific means. Those historians were extremely well attuned to matters of theory and methodology, and especially to quantification, which in the 1960s and 70s generated vast quantities of articles and monographs and produced an ever more fragmented field of historical knowledge. As technical studies multiplied, synthesis grew more difficult, to the point that many historians ceased even trying to mold their individual case studies into general arguments, or if they did seek to generalize, they employed theory or the construction and refinement of models or other forms of synthesis that were practiced in the social sciences. Narrative, which had always been the historian's main tool for synthesizing monographic studies, seemed to lack rigor and fell into disuse. The new military history, however, never renounced narrative, at least not in the form described by the man who gave it its name and described its most important parameters in 1976, John Schrey. He did so in the introduction to A People Numerous and Armed, a collection of 10 essays on the American Revolution, previously published between 1963 and 1975, which Oxford University Press reissued in a single volume for the bicentennial. In those essays, Schrey treated the Revolution and the War for Independence as historically inseparable experiences, unlike most historians who treated them as conceptually distinct. Schrey blamed the pernicious division between histories of the revolutionary politics and ideology on the one hand, and accounts of the War of Independence on the other, on the disconnection of military history from history in general. Military historians, he said, had shaped their narratives around operations, generalship, decisive battles, and so on. remaining mostly indifferent to issues of larger historiographical significance. Non-military historians, he said, have felt justified in disregarding books from which so little is to be learned about the non-military past, and concentrated on either explaining the origins of the revolution in the 1760s and early 70s, 1760s and early 70s, or describing its institutional and political consequences, especially the creation of a viable nation-state under the Constitution in the 1780s and beyond. The study of the War of Independence might have bridged that gap, those separate shores, but instead it became the gulf that divided them. Contemplating that dispiriting gap made Scheid what he called an evangelist for a new military history, an approach based on a short list of propositions amounting to a creed that war changes society, that strategy and military policy are aspects of politics, that the incidents of military service reflects and affects social structure, that the events and patterns of armed struggle help to shape the way people think about themselves and others, and so on, through a catalog of specific ways in which the impact of armed force may be felt. Such an approach, he argued, could produce a better understanding of how the Revolutionary War links what caused it to what it produced, and created a unified account of the American Revolution. What Scheid advocated, and why he enclosed "new" in quotation marks every time he used it to modify military history, had nothing to do with novel methodologies, had nothing to do with theoretical models of war and revolution. It was rather a kind of thoroughly contextualized military history that he himself had written a decade before, toward Lexington, the role of the British Army in the coming of the Revolution, in which several historians of the previous generation, notably William Wilcox, T. Harry Williams, and Wesley Frank Craven, who was Scheid's own doctoral supervisor, had also written books that were the new military history avant la lettre. Early-stage graduate students like me, groping to understand the place of war in American history and hoping to write history of the most modern, approvable kind, did not pause to wonder if the quotation marks around "new" signified any skepticism of the social science history, which we thought of as the very embodiment of scholarly rigor. We therefore read Scheid's introduction as a manifesto, rather than what it was, an admonition to remember the first principles of historical craftsmanship, that is, the historian's obligation to incorporate all evidence relevant to questions at hand and to include all relevant elements of context with the goal of producing comprehensive narratives. Luckily for me and my fellow naifs, reading those 10 brilliant essays alongside the case studies of Agincourt, Waterloo, and the Somme that John Keegan had simultaneously published in the face of battle obviated the worst effects of failing to understand what John was talking about. In those essays, we found approaches to emulate as researchers and models to inspire us as writers, and that mattered most of all. Mistaking the introduction for a manifesto, moreover, helped validate war as a topic worthy of study for students of supervisors who had little interest in military history. Scheid's spare description of what the new military history required set a low bar for those of us who wanted to try it out. Because he articulated an approach, not an orthodoxy, we had no theories to master, no pre-existing issues deemed worthy of explanation, no corpus of distinguished works that we had to defer to. Instead, we were free to rely on sources themselves to suggest what questions we wanted to answer, and we could steal, magpie-like, whatever methods we needed from other new histories and their coordinate disciplines. Over the decade that followed, numerous early career scholars traveled a path that Scheid had pointed out, often to destinations far from the Revolutionary era. Many of us tried out our work in conference panels before more senior commentators like Don Higginbotham, Peter Karsten, and Scheid himself, and in due course published our work in articles and monographs. Most of us, lucky enough to put a foot on the first rung of the tenure ladder, occupied positions conventionally defined by period and geography rather than by subdisciplinary orientation, so we never had to admit to being military historians of any sort. But rather, well, there's a penalty for that, but only as historians interested in the study of war in an interdisciplinary context. Openly or sub rosa, however, we were practicing the new military history. And most of us found our way to each other over time. Now, this group effort evolved into a body of work that nobody actually anticipated. But there were signs, 3 signs, in fact, that something was afoot when a quarterly journal was founded, War and Society, in 1983, to publish articles at the intersection between war and broader issues, without restriction of geography or era. A second portent appeared in the surprising number of review essays that used the term, not only in journals like Military Affairs, but in mainstream venues as well, which parsed the distinguishing characteristics of what the review essayists treated as a subdiscipline. At the beginning of the 90s, a third augury appeared when John Whiteclay Chambers, an early enthusiast of the approach, persuaded Oxford University Press to sponsor a comprehensive 1-volume reference guide to the study of war, peace, and the military throughout American history. It took almost a decade for John to bring that to Oxford Companion to completion, but when it was finally finished and published, it ran to 900 pages, had 500 contributors, 1,000 articles on everything from the 17th century wars of colonization to the Persian Gulf War of 1991. Its explicit intent was to furnish not only information and reliable sources of suggestions for reading and so on, but a conceptual framework for scholarly synthesis intended to point the way to narratives that would fully connect war and American historical development. Meanwhile, a shift in the broader profession during the 1980s had made such a hope seem reasonable, because eminent figures like Lawrence Stone and Bernard Bailyn had begun calling for historians to return to writing in the narrative mode. Not because they particularly cared about military history, and they didn't, but because they believed that structural analysis and quantification were inhibiting the production of usable syntheses describing change over time, accounting for human agency, and accounting for contingency, all the elements of narrative and all the things that made history accessible and intriguing to readers beyond the academy. Stone's and Bailyn's concerns resonated so strongly with those of Scheid that the core of new military historians, a sort of secret fellowship, quietly, the hope within that core quietly spread that we might actually produce work of interest beyond ourselves, work of interest to the academy as a whole, for historiography in general. The Battle Cry of Freedom, published in 1988, seemed to bring the promised land within sight. Jim McPherson's big narrative, written to the most rigorous professional standards, demonstrated the transformative significance of war itself and showed that storytelling vivid enough to attract thousands of lay readers could also serve a serious purpose. By the turn of the century, the new military history had matured into a sprawling subfield to a degree that I hope gratified Scheid, who could hardly have foreseen such a result when he argued for improving the treatment of the War of Independence in 1976. In the mid-aughts, the multi-volume reference works arrived in the 2s and 3s. The Oxford Companion had only been a pioneer. These are multi-volume reference works. And in 2007, major state-of-the-field essays appeared in journals of record, in the Journal of American History and the American Historical Review, no less, to report on trends that evidently heralded the further integration of military studies into general historical studies. The robust literature that Wayne Lee and Robert Citino surveyed in those review essays showed evidence of convergence in the genre of microhistory between military writers and cultural historians, including Natalie Zeman Davis and and Laurel Ulrich, real literary artists who appealed to remarkable ranges of readers. And so did the writers of military history, like David Hackett Fisher in Paul Revere's Ride and Washington's Crossing, or Lawrence Babbitt's in Devil of a Whipping, or Al Young in Masquerade, who was not by any means a new military historian, just a fellow who believed that war was worth studying because you could address issues of class and gender as he did in that marvelous book. So historians of the new military persuasion were using synecdoche, just like really sophisticated historians did, to make larger points from tightly focused narratives. But to a degree that other social historians and cultural historians did not, the military historians were drawn increasingly to broad narratives, like John Ferling's Almost a Miracle, the American Victory in the War of Independence, 2007. Big, sweeping narratives that seemed to promise to connect the shores that John Shai had seen separated by the gulf of military history. Now, both tightly focused and broad-gauged approaches, but the latter most directly, have exerted steady pressure on the so-called grand narratives, otherwise known as master narratives, meta-narratives, or standard narratives, that can stand for generations, becoming so ingrained as to seem almost a part of the natural order. So much has the new military history called these cultural framing stories into question that since the turn of the century, that War and Society has devoted its current issue, the first number of its 40th volume, to examining how this approach has affected grand narratives in Europe, the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Australia. This seems to me to be the culmination of work done since the 1970s to situate the history of war in an ever-expanding array of contexts. Its challenges to the grand narrative of American history specifically is the case that I will argue in the remainder of the hour. Americans' commonplace notion that their shared past is that of a peace-loving nation whose history, in essence, the story of expanding liberty, political rights, and prosperity in a steadily growing nation, that peaceful narrative has been marked by three great wars, all forced upon the United States, which together defined the nation's character. The three monuments that dominate the central axis of the Mall in Washington, D.C., symbolize this master narrative. In Washington's obelisk, Lincoln's Doric temple, and the new World War II memorial between them at the head of the reflecting pool. The story begins in a Revolutionary War when 13 colonies emancipated themselves from British imperial subjection and created a nation based on universal values, the values of liberty and equality that the founders stated in the Declaration of Independence and then specified in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. In the following century, the Civil War settled the most crucial issue that the revolutionary generation had been unable to address, which was the question of slavery. And that, in turn, affirmed the permanence of the Union under an amended Constitution that extended citizenship and its rights to all native-born Americans, irrespective of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Finally, in the 20th century, Americans answered the call to defend freedom a third time, leading the Allied nations to victory over the Axis powers and expanding the sphere of liberty in the world at large by establishing national self-determination, democracy, and equality as international rights. The announcement stone of the World War II memorial makes all this clear in 59 words, which I will quote. Here in the presence of Washington and Lincoln, one, the 18th century father, and the other, the 19th century preserver of our nation, we honor those 20th century Americans who took up the struggle during the Second World War and made the sacrifices to perpetuate the gift our forefathers entrusted to us, a nation conceived in liberty and justice. This grand narrative of freedom created, preserved, and extended does not deny that there was a pre-revolutionary history, and it does not deny the existence of other American wars, but it simply sidelines them. Just as the Vietnam Memorial and the Korean War Memorial parallel the Lincoln on either side, off the central axis of them all. Now, such a blanket dismissal of so much history would make any historian wince, if not weep. But the cultural power of his scheme was enormous during the Cold War, when it promoted consensus and national purpose. Its power remains undeniable today, principally because Americans have come to disagree so bitterly over its implications. New military historians never denied the significance of those three great wars, but rather they insisted on situating them within larger contexts and longer perspectives. The starting point was to observe that the American Revolution occurred not at the beginning of American history, but in the middle. That is to say, at the midway point between the late 15th century, when European contact across the Atlantic occurred, and the present day. Wars endemic among Native American peoples for centuries before the Europeans arrived had evolved into a variety of forms. Transatlantic contexts, however, intensified them by introducing new trade goods and diseases during the 16th century, and then massively magnified their destructive, transformative effects after permanent colonies were established on the continental mainland at the beginning of the 17th century. Historians like Ian Steele, whose pioneering synthesis Warpaths in 1993 delineated the consequences of wars between native peoples, wars between natives and colonizers, and imperial wars in which native groups acted in alliance with competing European empires, making the historical agency of Indian groups unmistakable. His work and that of others, including such ethnohistorians as Daniel Richter and Greg Dowd, converged to demonstrate how profoundly Indians, acting independently, shaped early North American development. They agreed that by the last quarter of the 17th century, native groups, accustomed to playing off European colonies and empires against one another, had created a North American balance of power, a system for organizing and restraining violence, a system they maintained for generations thereafter. These findings found such ready acceptance that in the year 2000 it was possible for a nervous professor to stand before a roomful of historians, senior to himself, and argue that native peoples and their policies had not only triggered the greatest Anglo-French War of the 18th century, but also determined its outcome. And watch, to his amazement, to see them accept with barely a wink, or blink, or nod, a claim that would have seemed absurd just 10 years or 15 years before. The realization that native agency crucially shaped North American history finished off the myth of the vanishing Indian, an implicit pillar of the grand narrative, which is a state-centered narrative above all. It became impossible to avert one's gaze from imperialism and empire as formative influences in North American history. U.S. historians' long-standing habit of regarding 1898 as the beginning of American imperialism made no sense at all in light of a half-millennium-long history that included native peoples and made it clear that wars of colonization and imperial wars were by far the most common kind of military conflict in North America, both before and after the independence of the United States. This was not merely the view of new military historians, but ethno-historians as well, who studied the place of warfare in Indian cultures and determined war's effects on and examined war's effects on native nations. Both recognized that empire was in its essence an act, the subordination of one group by another, of which Indians and Europeans were equally capable. A victorious group might attempt to make permanent the unequal partnership between itself and a client group or groups by creating formal institutional structures, but empire in that sense, empire with laws and bureaucrats and rituals and monuments, that was a product of human propensities, of the human propensity for imperialism, not its cause. Moreover, even state-organized empires on the European model could only survive as long as client groups acquiesced in their status. The realization that successful empires endured because their subalterns, in effect, consented to imperial rule permitted the construction of yet broader narratives, more inclusive narratives that centered on wars and their effects. When applied to the revolutionary United States, the long assumed contradiction between Republican political principles and imperial behavior simply vanished. Now, every serious student of the Revolution had always known that the founders spoke of the United States as an empire for liberty. But military historians understood that this was not just a metaphorical flourish. During the War of Independence, the revolutionaries had done everything they could to conquer Canada, and failing in the attempt, turned to expelling British allied Iroquois populations from New York and campaigning to seize the Ohio Valley. When the ink on the Peace of Paris in 1783 was scarcely dry, they set out to colonize the continental interior. Congressional land ordinances in 1784 and 85 established procedures for the settlement and incorporation of settlements in the West in national territories that the Northwest Ordinance systematized in 1787 to create a virtual charter for the Empire of Liberty. That Congress adopted that ordinance without dissent, or even as the Constitutional Convention anguished over every provision of a new system of government, testified to how deeply American citizens approved of empire and how automatically they accepted the dispossession of native nations as essential to extending the blessings of liberty beyond the Appalachian Range. The political creativity of the new United States was nowhere more evident than in the weaving of this new ideological cloak for the imperial impulse that had made provincial soldiers like George Washington such willing servants of the crown during the 7 Years' War. The new military historian's emphasis on empire is integral to Republican national institutions, politics, and policies, made clear why the Constitution's establishment of a standing army under federal control was not a problem for North Americans, or formerly British subjects in North America. That was because a tiny U.S. army would only be used in the territories to protect colonizing settlers and to control Indians. It would never, like the British Army, become an agency of internal control because the Constitution and Second Amendment, taken together, ensured that state governments and their militias were responsible for policing disorderly groups within the states. Only if insurrectionary violence crossed state lines or threatened national authority could the president order governors to place their militias under federal command, and then only temporarily until the emergency passed and the insurrection was suppressed. In states that retained slavery, the militia's responsibility for internal police had a different effect. It made armed white citizens the state-authorized enforcers of racial hierarchy and the discipliners of enslaved African-American populations. As a practical matter, this division of authority made perfect sense. As a mechanism for republican governance, it was essential to the early national conception of federalism. Finally, war and society historians' emphasis on making the aftermath of war integral to their narratives cast the origins of the revolution in a new light. Shaw had shown the way toward Lexington, where he described how a British army moved by stages from being an institution that Anglo-Americans valued and embraced in many cases during the 7 Years' War to being a force that they reviled by 1775 as the very engine of British tyranny. Seen in this light, the disorder and crisis that beset the empire after 1763 were less anticipations of a revolutionary break with Britain than the unanticipated after effects of a military victory so complete, with conquests so vast, that imperial governance on the pre-war model was simply impossible. Debates over the future of newly acquired territories shouldered aside after the proclamation of 1763 came roaring back with the Quebec Act and the Tea Act when they coincided in 1774 to destroy comity within the empire once and for all. Viewed in this light, the most striking features of the break with Britain were how much the dissolution of the empire was a consequence of the 7 Years' War and how much the revolution was a product of the War of Independence. How speedily American leaders went about constructing their own imperial means of imposing order on an infinitely alluring, dangerously unstable continental interior. The revolutionary period could no longer be read simply as a quarter-century-long process of national liberation by which Americans fought free of a monarchical empire to establish a republic. Rather, it traced a 40-year-long arc from a monarchical empire's epoch-making military victory through its unanticipated breakup in civil war, to revolution, to the creation of an imperial republic eager to extend its sway far into the continental interior. Looking back from 1796, when President Washington announced his intention to retire from office, thoughtful observers concluded that a miracle of some kind had occurred. The United States, in that year, had succeeded in reorganizing itself as a nation-state and as a functioning empire, capable of simultaneously suppressing armed Indian resistance in the Northwest Territory and of putting down an armed domestic insurrection in western Pennsylvania. An imperial system was in place, capable of asserting American power over the lands south of the Great Lakes as far as the Mississippi. When white settlers flooded west beyond the Appalachians, the native nations of the interior faced the gravest threat they had ever known, an existential crisis unimaginable a generation earlier. That terrible future materialized in the War of 1812 and its aftermath. Understood within the grand narrative only as a reconfirmation of American independence, the War of 1812 was in fact the United States' first imperial war, justified as all American wars would be thereafter, down to the present day, as a war of liberation. Repeated campaigns to free Canada from British control failed, but the destruction of native power between the valley of the Tennessee and the Gulf of Mexico was relentless and brutal and continued long after the Treaty of Ghent, ending only in 1819 with the annexation of Florida. That imperial milestone, which coincided with the admission of Alabama to the Union, completed the opening of the most fertile lands east of the Mississippi to a kind of liberty distinguished by the right of American citizens to enslave people of African descent, profit from their uncompensated labor, and own their offspring and descendants as chattel property. If in the northern states where slavery had either been extinguished or set on a gradual path to extinction, increasing numbers of white American citizens were uncomfortable with these developments, they could do no more than to moderate the pace of the expansion of slavery with the Missouri Compromise of the following year. The majority of American citizens understood neither slavery nor imperial expansion as inconsistent with Republican government. Nor would they until another imperial war in 1846 to 48 and a new debate over what to do with an inconceivably large acquisition of territory that followed it, had that not shifted the very ground on which the Republican empire that was the United States stood. A look back from 1819 over the previous 65 years reveals a pattern nowhere evident or accounted for or accountable within the grand narrative. A great war for empire, begun and ended as a consequence of native agency, had triggered unpredictable political transformations, utterly upending pre-war authority in North America. An American imperial republic had arisen in the ruin of its predecessor and dismantled independent native control over the lands ceded to the United States in the 1783 Treaty of Paris. Racial slavery, which in the 1780s had seemed obsolescent, had become the central engine of the American economy and the principal driver of territorial expansion, permanently embedded in the political order. This pattern, which makes the American Revolution an unintended consequence of an excessively successful war for empire, might be dismissed as just so much tinkering with periodization, were it not virtually replicated in the 19th century. Once again, native agency triggered that transformation. A great peace treaty negotiated in 1840 between northern plains groups living east of the Rockies, the Arapahoes and Cheyennes, and their powerful imperialist enemies of the southern plains, the Comanches and Kiowas, freed the latter to devote their full attention to revenge-raiding Mexican settlements south of the Rio Grande. The years of destructive raids that followed destabilized and weakened the states of northern Mexico, undermining popular allegiance to the central government, just as the American annexation of Texas precipitated a catastrophic deterioration in U.S.-Mexican relations. Ultimately, chauvinist American politicians used the desolation of northern Mexico to justify intervention beyond the Rio Grande in 1846, a benevolent campaign to impose stability on a chaotic borderland and liberate Mexicans from the misrule of their own government. The ensuing war between ill-matched adversaries ended yet less than a year and a half later when Mexico City fell to Winfield Scott's army of invasion. And soon thereafter, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo transferred the northern half of Mexico to the United States. More than 1/3 of a billion acres of land between the upper Rio Grande and the Pacific. As in 1763, the sudden influx of so vast a realm soon destroyed the political stability of the conquering power. In the 18th century, the British Empire in North America survived a similarly disastrous victory for only 12 years. Now it took 13 years for the United States to fall apart in disunion. In 1861, as in 1775, a civil war spawned the revolutionary transformation, or revolutionary transformations in the definition of citizenship and the relationship between local and national institutions of government. In both cases, the third act of the great drama of empire and revolution centered on the post-revolutionary subjugation of Western native nations, groups that had heretofore enjoyed independence of action. Only the pace and completeness of the subjugation differed, whereas it took 50 years after the Revolutionary War to pacify native resistance east of the Mississippi. After Appomattox, the U.S. Army needed only 25 years to complete the confinement of all Indian groups in the Trans-Mississippi West to reservations, a brutal process that came to its bloody, disgraceful end near Wounded Knee Creek in southwestern South Dakota on December 29th, 1890. The imperial impulse did not vanish with the consolidation of U.S. control over the vast territorial empire that now stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but rather changed its shape. The impossibility of absorbing something like 15 million racially diverse Spanish colonial subjects into a transoceanic empire in 1898 compelled the United States to revise its previous system of imperial governance. The reformulation of empire, which followed the Spanish-American War, did not alter the American rationale for making war. Instead, Americans continued to regard the making of war as just any time it could be understood or construed as preserving or expanding the sphere of liberty. Now, however, the goal of military intervention in areas where disorder threatened American interests and values would be limited to stabilizing critical zones, and with the goal of creating what Americans understood as the conditions of liberty, that is, free enterprise, the protection of private property, the rule of law, and so on, in temporary protectorates. Henceforth, the United States would permanently annex only relatively small areas such as Hawaii and Guam as sites for naval and later air bases, granting the inhabitants some version of U.S. citizenship. Otherwise, U.S. control was construed as a temporary measure to preserve American power, to defend freedom and the creation of American hegemony. Hegemonic imperialism, then, became the new face of American empire in the 20th century and indeed in the 21st. Once American interventions in World War I and afterward in Russia made clear to American citizens where this new imperial model was pointed would lead toward isolationism, which emerged as a form of exclusive nationalism marked by withdrawal from foreign entanglements, complemented domestically by a reinforcement of white supremacy and by the restriction of immigration from racially suspect areas abroad. Isolationism did not mean a wholesale retreat from empire, but rather an insistence that the interventions undertaken by the United States would extend only to earlier established spheres of influence in the Americas and the Pacific. It did, however, mean that American foreign policy turned away from the growth of fascism, militarism, and neo-imperialism in Europe and Japan, even as the world lurched toward World War II, which Richard Overy, in a recent book, has argued was the world's last great imperial war. Only a direct attack on American imperial holdings in the Pacific by the forces of Imperial Japan compelled American entry into the Second World War, an engagement that did indeed determine the war's outcome along revolutionary lines by creating the United Nations as a custodian of a rules-based international system which seemed to portend, at least, an end to imperial wars. The reconstruction of Japan and West Germany along lines friendly to capitalism, democratic governance, and the rule of law evidently validated the interventionist protectorate model that the United States had advocated, although never actually implemented, in the Caribbean, Central America, and the Philippines during the 19-teens, 1920s, and 1930s. Imperialism at last seemed dead, except that it wasn't. With the Cold War, American interventionism resumed, first relying on the authorization of the United Nations, as in the case of the Korean War, and then on the acquiescence of the UN and the mobilization of U.S.-led alliance systems like NATO, as in the Vietnam War and Afghan War, to avoid the appearance of naked imperialism. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, however, even the fig leaf of internationalism became optional attire. The Second Gulf War, now 20 years ago, looked very much like the stark imperialist war of choice that it was. And the current maintenance of more than 750 U.S. military bases around the world testifies to the undiminished willingness of the United States to make war in the name of liberty, in the expectation that America can shape the world to conform with American values and interests by force if need be. What all this means for historiography in the United States today is that now scholars routinely write empire into U.S. history in ways they did not do a half century ago when the new military history was new, and imperialism was a concept that Marxist scholars used. That American historians now readily affirm the importance of empire, I think, has a great deal to do with the emergence of the narrative I have outlined, and hence reflects the case that Shaw made about the need to take war seriously as a factor in American development. Acknowledging the prevalence of imperial warfare in the American narrative has brought scholars routinely to make empire and its wars an intrinsic part of the stories they tell about who modern Americans are and how they got to be that way. While it would be absurd to argue that there is a direct link between Shaw's 1976 appeal for a new military history of the Revolutionary War and such recent narrative syntheses as Alan Taylor's trilogy, American Colonies, American Revolutions, American Republics, or Woody Holton's Liberty is Sweet, or Pekka Hamalanen's Indigenous Continent, that would be a crazy connection to make. Nonetheless, Shaw's limited appeal for a new military history almost a half century ago undeniably started a hare that a pack of historians followed with great enthusiasm, some for the rest of their careers, and the result over time has been the accumulation of a corpus of studies and narratives that have in fact incorporated war and imperialism into general narratives of American development. Narratives with great consequences for how Americans now periodize, create storylines, and discern larger significance. All this has led, finally, to the emergence of an academic counter-narrative resolutely at odds with the persistent, pernicious assumption that the Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II by themselves can be understood as defining America's national character. What connects America's three revolutionary wars for freedom within the standard narrative is less a falsifiable story than the faith assertion that Americans are a free and peaceable people whose love of liberty, equality, and self-determination makes them exceptional in human history. The counter-narrative's insistence that all three revolutionary wars for liberty emerged from prior wars fought for the pursuit of power, wars of empire, may offer a glimmer of the hope that the old grand narrative's exceptionalist grip may at last be weakening. The complex, paradoxical story of empire and liberty that I believe to be John Shai's legacy does not require anyone to deny the special cultural significance of the three great wars or their immense and lasting impact on the United States and the world beyond, only insisting that they must be understood in context. That understanding requires only the affirmation of the ordinariness of the United States, since, as Anthony Pagden has justly observed throughout recorded history, empire has been a way of life for most of the peoples of the world, either as conquered or conquerors, always. All Americans have to do, really, is to accept that their biggest story, the one that tells them who they really are, is a tale that does not flatter them in the telling. Grand narratives are sturdy frameworks for belief, but they are not immutable. The one that is so problematic for us today has a history. It originated in Lincoln's formulation of the Civil War's meaning in the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural Address, both of which appear in full on the interior walls of the Lincoln Memorial. That monument itself was erected as a rebuke and a counterpoint to the grand narrative that had been propagated for the previous half-century by the devotees of the Lost Cause, who had busily erected statues of Confederate heroes all across the South for 3 decades before 1922, the year of the Lincoln Memorial's dedication. The Lincolnian, or Northern Unionist version of the grand narrative prevailed only during the Cold War, when the association of American political ideals with the founding and the Civil War was extended to encompass World War II and embodied in new rituals intended to inculcate patriotism in a new generation, such as the recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance at the start of every school day and the singing of the national anthem before high school athletic games. The incorporation of World War II as a permanent part of the grand narrative came in 2004, nearly on the 60th anniversary of D-Day, with the dedication of the World War II Memorial. And even that hardly settled the matter. Even now, Americans still find it possible to wrangle over the fate of Civil War statues, bitterly disagree over the propriety of kneeling while the Star-Spangled Banner is sung before athletic events, and debate with bitter fury what should and should not be taught, or even what words can and cannot be said in the teaching of American history in public school courses. All this disagreement proves that the American grand narrative can, in fact, be changed. If it were truly permanent, it would not matter so much to us. It would be folly to think that recent trends in academic history will change things anytime soon. Grand narratives change grudgingly and less in response to historiographical currents than changes in political culture and external circumstances. But insofar as historiography influences teaching, and teaching influences how students perceive the world in later life, the long game matters. All we ourselves can contribute is to write history, military history or any other sort, that can persist over the long haul. To do this is to keep faith with what John Shai most deeply believed, that our first duty as historians is to practice the craft of history with diligence and integrity, always aware that to be valid, analysis must account for all the known and relevant evidence, that to be productive, syntheses must not only integrate analytical arguments to eliminate common themes, but speak to issues of wider significance, and that to be meaningful narratives must give full scope to chance and contingency, taking full notice of the character of historical agents and the contexts within which they acted. To do so just might, with good fortune, produce works that can stand up beyond their creator's own time, as Schei's own works have. It is my own belief that if they do, that is, those works still to be written, if they do stand up, it will be because their writers share the aspiration that John Schei eloquently described in the afterword to the second edition of A People Numerous and Armed. To reconstruct, he said, as nearly as possible, some segment of the vanished world as it actually was. Not merely the visible official past that readily finds its way into the archives, but the look, feel, and sound of the past as real people experienced it, and also the deeply buried past, the invisible forces propelling those people in directions they seldom knew they were going. In other words, he wrote, confessing all, to absorb as much of the truth as I could, and then to tell it as best I knew how. Thank you. If I haven't worn you out, I'd be glad to talk about any of this stuff.
Thank you, Fred. That was a wonderful talk. Raise your hand with any questions, and Kayla or myself will walk to you with the microphone.
Okay, well, let's have supper. Yes.
So at the end,
Oh, wait, there's a microphone approaches.
So at the end, you talked about his importance in looking at the look, feel, and sound of the past. I know that John Schei spent an early summer in his academic career at Fort Ticonderoga. Do you know at all how living history might have impacted his scholarship?
No. I honestly don't. I do know that living history has a very considerable impact on the way that academic history gets translated into popular understandings. And it does so, in my view, because I've dealt a bit with historical reenactors and living history recreations. I do know that it works because it captures the imagination in ways that reading words on a page for some people cannot. So it has occurred to me that there are sort of three principal ways of connecting with the past. One is the way historians do it. You know, sitting there in their studies, grinding away, producing words that people may or may not read, and then going on to do something else or have supper. The second is genealogy, which creates an organic relationship between the person in the present and past people to whom they can relate because they are related. And the third is to put the past on, to feel what it was like to wear scratchy, linsey-woolsey garments in the summer heat, to smell what people smell like when they do, to eat what people ate, or a version of it, cooked as they did, or often as not, barely did in the past. And also to sleep outside on the bare ground and to wake up stiff and uncomfortable, then have to lug a heavy musket around for the rest of the day and smell the stink of the powder. That also creates an imaginative connection with the past that's very powerful. I mean, it's powerful for children, it's powerful for their parents, it's certainly overwhelmingly meaningful for the people who practice living history. So while I can't say that John Shai ever mentioned that, at least not in my hearing, and I'd be glad to know if anybody here, because you all, I expect, mostly knew John, if he ever did talk about it. But I would say that it's an extremely important part of coming to terms with war in the American past. And that's what John really wanted to do most of all, I think. Anybody else?
Thanks, Fred. That was fantastic. My question, you mentioned toward the end that external events external to historiography, of course, have a huge impact on these grand narratives. My question is about the Vietnam War and its influence on the new military, on the rise of the new military history. So I just am asking you to reflect on that.
Thanks, Greg. That's a great question. It has everything to do with it. John, that preface and the preface to the second edition and the afterword, they really are about the way Vietnam shaped his interests and his need to write about the connections between military history and the military past. I mean, the American past, generally. Absolutely did. I mean, each of the essays in A People Numerous and Armed is prefaced by a brief, italicized paragraph about where he was when he wrote it and why he wrote it. The most moving ones come near the end when he's talking about sitting in London watching TV shows on the news showing American cities burning in 1971, in the riots, and the real issue, I think, is that Vietnam has everything to do with it, because it was an imperial war, and confronting that was hard for John, I think. He was a product of a period when everybody thought empire was over or should be over, and that the UN could take care of things. He'd served in Japan, in the occupation force. He was aware of how vast American commitments were around the world. And then to see Vietnam, which was a perversion, I think he believed, of the good done by American intervention in World War II and the aftermath, that was just heartbreaking for him. So I think it was extraordinarily important. And it was important to people who practiced military history in the new form, because a whole generation grew up, through being subject to the draft or watching people they knew go off to military service in Vietnam and come back in different form than they left. It meant that they had a lot of explaining to themselves to do about what this war meant. That was certainly true for me. Now, so there's a big impetus behind this. And I think the writing of empire into American history by people like Taylor or Hämäläinen or you, I mean, not that you're a new military historian, but I mean, it's what people have done because we're all trying to come to terms with that still. And now I'm going to move beyond that to something that's even more, I think, alarming, that's become visible lately. The rise of white nationalism in its modern form began in the aftermath of Vietnam. Some of the earliest adherents were disaffected veterans who went to Idaho and set up encampments where they could train for a coming revolution that would break apart the United States into a governable white republic and everything else. They evolved an ideology of leaderless resistance, which camouflaged the fact that they were, in fact, a movement that did, in fact, coordinate among its various parts. And we are now seeing exactly the fruits of that in the Proud Boys, in the Three Percenters, in the Oath Keepers, and people who really believe, that the boogaloo is coming. That scares me half to death. And I think the greatest argument for admitting the importance of empire in American history is to confront exactly its consequences in that. Because if you look at the way that imperial wars have influenced race relations and nationalistic kinds of expressions in the past, you see there's a strong positive correlation, right? Between the end of the War of 1812 and its imperial dimensions and Indian removal. Between the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction and the intense reaction of post-Reconstruction Americans against racial equality. In the aftermath of World War I, in the intensification of a new Klan movement and the intensification of white supremacy and anti-Catholicism and immigration restriction, you can't separate that from the experience of the First World War and the revulsion of Americans against having to sacrifice lives abroad for causes that they didn't understand, hadn't been explained to them fully, because they thought Americans went to war to make the world safe for democracy. And surely they thought democracy was what they were losing at home, because their republic seemed to be, its very basis seemed to be threatened in the 1920s. I don't think Vietnam's any different from that in its effects. And I don't think that we fully understand the intrinsic relationship between imperial wars and their post-war effects along exactly those lines. And it scares the living daylights out of me.
Hi, this is really in some ways a follow-up because it's on exactly the same point that Greg Dowd asked about. It strikes me in reading the essay in People Numerous and Armed about Long Bill Scott that the Vietnam War also had an influence on how John Shai read evidence, because he makes some interesting side comments, even though the essay is very much about the 18th century, about the way in which particular descriptions of motivations for fighting, which are extracted from processes of interrogation by unsympathetic people, generate evidence that is unreliable. And I think that's part of what he develops in that essay. He starts out with one account of who this one particular soldier was and how opportunistic his involvement in the revolution appeared to be, and then he digs and digs and digs to undo that. So in a way, it shows a changed relationship to the kinds of things one finds in archives.
That is an extremely good point, and I couldn't agree more. In fact, I can't say anything that would go beyond what you just said. I mean, that's exactly right. It was one of the things that got me going on the social history of war when I was a graduate student was exactly that essay, and the way that his reading of the evidence seemed to be just mind-blowing. And not just that, but absolutely plausible. You know, it made perfect sense to me, and I think it comes out of exactly what you said, John's confrontation with Vietnam. Now, you know, there's the whole issue of presentism, you know, arises in this. But I don't think that's the case here. I think it's simply being made aware by the world you live in of a reality that influences the way that we reimagine the past. And for me, that particular essay was just a revelation. So, yeah, you're quite right. Thank you for that comment. Anybody else? Can I ask you a question? Really, I mean, I would love to know what you think, because this is something that I've been thinking about a lot in trying to write this essay, or this talk, sorry, which was originally twice as long as what you heard. You're luckier than you know. Right, here's the deal. Let's imagine just for discussion's sake, that I'm right. That grand narratives are changeable. That the three-war revolutionary exceptionalist narrative of American history can be superseded by something that's truer to what we academics think of as the real case, which is that empire is a big part of this and needs to be accounted for. Let's assume that's right. Okay, well, what would that narrative look like? How would it work? What moral message would it send to Americans, and how would they react to that? Could they react to that? Yes.
Aren't we seeing that reaction in Florida right now? Sorry. Aren't we seeing that reaction in Florida, among other places right now? I mean, the grand narrative is changing. And what Ron DeSantis is doing especially, but it's going on in Tennessee, it's going on in Louisiana, it's going on elsewhere. I mean, I question, I guess, then, at once the grand narrative is changing, but yet forces are at work to take us back to nothing but the grand narrative, great white father approach to history. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
you made a good start. Yeah, there's another response back here, I think, in the upper ranks. Yeah, please.
Thank you for your talk, and especially for the question that just followed. I'd like to respond with a question, if I can. Would that not expose
No, please. Yeah, please do.
the moral issue around the problem of competition for sovereignty? Is the grand narrative that is to say not, in essence, a justification for U.S. sovereignty in all of these historical periods? And then what then does that require of us morally in our attempt to understand that U.S. sovereignty hasn't always been justified, hasn't always been grand? I'm just curious as I'm thinking through some of the own research that I'm doing as I think about populations like Maroons in places like Jamaica, or as I think about having read your work and loving your grand narratives about competitions in the continental interior where indigenous Americans or indigenous people lost sovereignty by the gun.
But that's a great comment. I think that this is this is exactly what makes it so hard to reckon with. You know, I mean, if we really do want to take account of a paradoxical relationship between liberty and power, we have to take both of them seriously. And if we want to look at the difference between democracy and war, we have to take both of them seriously. We can't privilege one over the other because they're all part of human life. So what I personally think is that if there's a way to reconcile that necessity for understanding paradox as part of the national grand narrative, then it ultimately depends above all on the willingness to be humble and not to imagine that the United States is somehow destined by providence to be the bearer of liberty for all the world. But also to acknowledge that the United States does stand for values that are of very considerable importance in the world today. Not ones that we necessarily live up to very well or invariably, but actually care about deeply and want, above all, to survive. And those values, you know, are not the property of white people. They're not the property of any tribe. They're the property of everybody who accepts citizenship and its responsibilities in the United States. So the first thing you'd have to do is to think of a grand narrative that is truly inclusive and sympathetic to all sides of what it means to be a sovereign nation. You know, you have ideals we have ideals that the Republic is founded on, and we have problems with adhering to those, and we have not always invariably defended them. We've sometimes behaved in ways that were utterly despicable, and we can't ignore either of those. So that's sort of like theology, you know, and the fallenness of humanity. And there is a guide to that, actually, in the writings of Reinhold Niebuhr, who in the 1950s talked about the paradoxes of American power and the irony of American history as he understood it. Niebuhr said, in effect, look, we're just human beings. We're sinners, and we do what sinners do in the world. But we also have ideas that are valuable in the world and that are precious to the world because they preserve good things, and the United States stands for them. So how then did Niebuhr imagine that the American role in the world should work out? Well, you know, he was a pretty sturdy anti-communist, but he was also a deeply critical voice on Vietnam from the very beginning. He was a voice of conscience because his point, I think, was, if I understand it right, that Americans are not exceptional. Exceptionalism is a form of pride, and pride is a sin. And because he was a theist, and because he profoundly believed that there was an inscrutable deity behind the existence of the world, and that history itself was necessarily opaque because we're only human beings looking at this. You know, we can only guess at what any divine intention is. He was arguing that we can't guess at that. We only have to do our best. And in that, we have to choose the best ideals and values we can, and we have to defend them as best we can without pride, but rather with humility. I don't know that any nation on earth has ever been able to construct a national narrative for itself along those lines. I really don't.
Thank you so much. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how, as these historiographies shift, historians' relationships with libraries and archives shift too, and maybe what you see as the role for places like the Clements, which was so integral to John's work in so many ways, being part of that story.
Another great question. I think that, well, I'll just say this up front. I mean, the Clements Library is one of the great treasures of American life, period. I made a little pilgrimage over there, as you know, this afternoon, Maggie, when I just to genuflect before the death of Wolfe. And also to just remind myself of how really rich and varied that the holdings of that place are. 1,000 lifetimes of steady study would not get even halfway to the bottom of that knowledge that could be gained from those holdings. So it's the eclectic quality and the range. I mean, of the modern Clements is just extraordinary. It wasn't always that way. I mean, that was a fairly, as the death of Wolfe presiding over the reading room would suggest, it's a pretty Anglophile organization in its initial conception. But that's just American history, right? That's how rich people thought about the past and, what they identified as what they wanted to emphasize. That doesn't mean that the present management of the Clements Library is all about collecting, tchotchkes from the British Empire in the 1750s. It's quite the opposite. And so, Clint, are you here today? Clinton? Before I came over, the graphics curator, Clinton, was showing me the most recent acquisition. It's just marvelous. From the 1890s. It's a bunch of classroom teaching aids. And on one part of it is, it's about American history. And one little panel is a completely grotesque recreation of the death of General Wolfe. And then, others of Balboa and Columbus and other recreations of those scenes, which the purpose of which was to help kids imagine themselves in connection with the past in 1890 or 1895 or whenever it was that was printed for classroom use. That's amazingly important. To have that ephemeral stuff available means that people can ask questions about what that really means. Because not all of it's laughable. I mean, in fact, those panels that I saw that Clinton showed me were just, blew my mind. Because I was seeing in them the kinds of teaching aids that my grandfather, who was born in 1893, had in his classroom when he was an elementary school student, which is the only education he had, an elementary school student in Oakdale, Illinois. And, I'm not sure I ever understood the old man during his lifetime, really, because I had no idea how he saw the world as a boy. I only knew him as an old man, and a kind of cranky old man at that, and, had views I didn't agree with. But those panels are a window into the minds of people in the United States in the era of the Spanish-American War, which, as I've argued, is something that we really need to come to terms with. And it's also a window into the mind of a man who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. That's the kind of reckoning that's possible through those kinds of collections. Because you never know what questions you're going to ask of them until you see them, right? You never know what it's going to make you think about. So it's not just the Clements. I'm not just praising you guys because I like the institution and respect it and have gotten a lot out of it over time. It's also the whole enterprise of collecting the past and making it available to responsible scholarly scrutiny and letting the chips fall where they may. That's the best thing about it to me.
You're the first person to get to see those because we only bought them on Saturday. So.
Thanks for that.
I would like to ask a question or raise a couple of points in answer to your question.
Please.
It's a very good question, and I would suggest that you've touched upon a couple of possible answers, one of which is the idea of presentism and the need to guard against it on the one hand. And I think that we need to guard against it more than ever at this point in our history. On the other hand, we need to guard against relativism at the same time, and the two can be seen as kind of opposites on the same spectrum. You raised the concept of contingency, and I think that's very, very important as well, and human agency. If my fading memory is correct, we obtained the Old Northwest to a great extent because of Lord Shelburne and his generosity and his love of America. And we didn't have to get that. We could have been hemmed in very easily because we had not really conquered the Northwest. And I think that contingency is very, very important. I would also wonder about the concept of unintended consequences. We very often, people charge into situations confident that they know what is right, what the facts are, and what the results will be. And as often as not, the results are sometimes at great odds to what they had hoped they would be. And I think that your plea for humbleness is terribly, terribly important. And your concept that we're all sinners is terribly important. If we forget that, then I think we can very easily and very generously create hell on earth for everyone. And this happens again and again. I wonder, too, about the, well, how shall I put this, the need to back away from some of the specifics and to try to determine what seems to be important and what is not important, a very important undertaking in the study of history. You mentioned exceptionalism, and I think we have to be very careful in addressing exceptionalism and in critiquing it. It seems to me there are three levels. For example, we can say that America is exceptional in that we're the only place on earth that in which 90 degrees east and 40 degrees north meet. And it's true. It's also irrelevant, but it does make us exceptional. But to what point? Of what importance? We can say of little or no importance. It would seem to me that there are three levels of exceptionalism: the mundane, perhaps more abstract, and finally a level that you've touched on, and almost the sacred, the idea of the moral, and those things are highly debatable, and in my estimation, very, very important. I think the need to touch on the intangibles, the things that can't be measured, is very, very important in any study of history. I think if we were to look back on the events leading up to the American Revolution, you would have to ask the question, how is it that we in the colonies, who are among the freest people on the face of the earth in 1763 or 65, or even as late as the early 1770s, how are we among the freest people on the face of the earth, among the most prosperous people on the face of the earth, among the most literate people on the face of the earth, how is it that we talk ourselves into a revolution? It's a mystery in a sense, but I think it can be addressed largely through the intangibles, the things that cannot be measured, feelings, emotions, fears. I think the propagandists created in us an immense amount of fear of the future about what Britain would do to us if we did not take action. So I would make an appeal that if we're going to talk about exceptionalism, there are really at least three levels that we should deal with. And the top one, I think, is ultimately the most important one, the most abstract, and the hardest to deal with. Thank you so much for your very fine talk.
Oh, thank you for that three-level analysis, which seems to me exactly right. I mean, exceptionalism is not an easy thing to talk about. It's wielded like a sword, you know, but it exists. It has a history, you know, and part of the history is that every nation thinks of itself as exceptional. That's human. It's also human to not be as good as your ideals, you know. And it's also human to think that you know what's best for other people. So thank you for the comment. I think that was very thoughtful. It was the three levels are, I think, precisely right. And it's a really helpful way to think about it. And I'm in your debt.
Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Have a good evening.
Thank you all.